Hello, everyone, and welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. I'm Greg, host and curator of the Indie Drop-In Network. Every week, we feature an episode from an independent podcast creator. Hit that follow button to find your next binge-worthy true crime podcast. Today's episode is a little different, but I think you're really going to love it. My friend Jeff, aka the podcast father, recently interviewed Captain, host of the hugely popular podcast True Crime Garage, and Jeff is kind enough to let me play that for you today. If you want to hear more interviews with podcasters and content creators, make sure to check out Jeff's show, Indie Podcaster. I'll put all the links to Indie Podcaster in the show notes below. Enjoy the show.
Begin.
You've been searching for a podcast. Want to know about some great artists? You've come to the right place. Indie Podcaster with your host, the podcast father.
Hey everyone, it's great to have you. Welcome to Indie Podcaster. I'm your host, Jeff, aka Podcast Father, and with me is my good friend, Mike Zago. He has a little pod himself, a pod with a bod. The Link, a podcast with Mike Zago. What's up, man?
What's going on? Thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this.
This is going to be a really cool adventure, and I appreciate you supporting me and supporting all these creators. You know, we'll call them artists because they really are.
Sure are.
And today, for episode number 1, we've got a good one. It is actually Captain. He's the co-host and co-creator of True Crime Garage. Mike, what do you know about True Crime Garage? I'm a huge fan myself.
These guys are major players in that true crime world, and it's a huge world. They do good research, but I do find it a little terrifying how much women seem to love true crime pods. What are you planning exactly? But I feel like, it's scary how popular they are, but it is cool to get into that dark side. So if that's your bag, get a pencil because there's notes to be taken about this one.
Yeah, and this is a massive one, right? This is an Apple Top 50 chart, always around there at least. Man, it's got over 500 episodes. You know, it's going over 6 years. It's a legitimate, huge podcast, and Captain's been a huge part of it. And the cool thing about this interview, Mike, that I had with him is, and everybody listening, he goes into detail on how it started. And then he actually talked about some of the dark, you referred to it as darkness, right? Mm-hmm. He talks about how hard that can be to turn that off and how important it is when he's not researching, because there is a lot of work, like you said, as far as that, how important it is to turn it off and walk away when you can. And it's crazy how it just starts out with a vision, right? And you don't know or even imagine or even particularly care about when you start if it's going to take off or not. And Captain talks about that in this interview, how it was just something him and his friend were doing for fun. Back when they started, they didn't even know how many listens they were getting. And boom, it just takes off into the sky. And now they are one of the top people in the true crime podcast game.
Very cool.
Without further ado, I think we will jump in and check it out. Joining me today is Captain from True Crime Garage. How's it going, man? I can't tell you. I'm so damn excited to have you on.
Yeah, I just did an interview from England, and they called it True Crime Gay Ridge. The whole time. Welcome, the Captain from True Crime Gay Ridge. I'm like, yeah, Gay Ridge is fine with me.
Kind of might take away a little bit of the man escape aspect of a garage, but you know, oh well.
Yeah,
man.
Because in the States we go, I'm going to go out to the garage, you know, but over there you'd have to go, I'm going out to the Gay Ridge. Doesn't sound as cool.
Doesn't sound quite as cool, but if there's beer involved, right, you might be able to make it work.
Yeah, that's a rite of passage is when you get your refrigerator out in the garage and you stock it full of beer. Like once that happens, you know you made it.
I like to listen to True Crime Garage and picture you're actually recording it in the garage. I know it's not the case, but it's like, it'd be badass if it was.
Well, it was the case for a long time, but in the summer, we literally would be dripping sweat all over our notes and then all over the computer. And then in the winter, we'd be freezing. And so then it was like, this is not good. But what people don't know is we've always been attached to a garage. So for a while, if you look at our logo, which our logo is not the actual garage we record in. We used to be above the garage, and that's why we had a window in the logo, because we were the guys in the window. And now we're underneath the garage. So we've always been connected to a garage.
That's awesome. So you went from the loft to the basement.
Yeah. So anytime people say, it's actually more like a bunker. But so when people are like, I know you're not in the garage, I'm like, well, technically we're in the garage.
Hey, that's all that matters. I mean, I wasn't going to argue with you either way, but so like I said, I'm excited to talk to you. And I've talked to a lot of independent podcasters over the last week, and you guys have established yourself over the last 5 years, 2015, I believe. Let me go ahead and tell you when I first heard of you guys. So I actually, up until last year, listened to mostly exclusively like professional wrestlers podcast.
Yeah.
Well, which there's a lot of them. There's a lot of good ones. But during the stay-at-home order, I actually got to work from home. And a lot of people didn't listen to as many podcasts because they were not commuting. I actually was able to listen to more because I was working from home and it was convenient. So I found you guys, and I found Case Files, and I just hooked from there, man. So, I mean, COVID actually got me connected and hooked on True Crime Garage.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Case Files as well. I don't listen to as many true crime podcasts as I used to, but it's just because that's what we do all week. So it seems like if I'm listening to a true crime podcast, it becomes it's almost like I feel like I'm doing work, even though I'm not doing work.
Makes perfect sense. And comparing the two of you guys, not really comparable, but it's like a nice change up for me to listen to both of them, because they're doing the more serious, straightforward tone, and you guys are doing your thing. You can tell your friends having a good time, but yet it's informative as well. The information is there and it's good.
Yeah, Nick's whole thing from the beginning was like you have to have certain expectations of yourself, and his whole thing was like, if you watched a documentary on the case that we covered, are we able to add something to it? And as you know, these documentaries are now getting more and more informative. So he really kind of from the beginning was like, you have to be an expert, even though you're just two guys sitting in a garage drinking beers. He brings the expertise to it. And I also think the difference between like him and a Case Files is like, Case Files is very informative. So that's why I have a lot of respect for those, for them and what they're doing. But they're coming at it as more of a dry, like we're not, and not a lot of opinions. Where Nick comes, I think there's definitely some episodes where you could almost hear the steam coming off of his head, because sometimes I have to tell him, like, you got to calm down. You're yelling into the microphone.
Yeah. And that's because he's into what he's talking about. So how did it all start, man? Like, I assume you guys knew each other before, obviously, but how did this all start?
So, I mean, I'll try to give you the shortened version. We both listened, we both were into unsolved mysteries when we were younger, and we actually rode the bus together. But he was older than I was, and he had a friend named Vince and a friend named Dave, and every day they would talk about unsolved mysteries. Well, fast forward to like 10 years later, we were in a rock band together. And when we'd go on these road trips, we would kind of just talk about a lot of just cases and unsolved mysteries and stuff like that. Then we lived together for a while, and we started watching these, like, they weren't made for TV movies, but so we just always talked about crime, and my father's a detective. So it was always kind of interesting to have somebody else in my life that kind of understood what my dad did. And so we both get laid off. This is probably 2015. We both had decent jobs. We got laid off. We both got severance packages, so we didn't have to work for a while. And I just moved back home to Columbus, and Nick's in Columbus. And so he would go, hey, why don't you come over, Wednesday for a beer? Because it didn't matter what day we hung out on because we didn't have to work the next day.
Right.
And would sit in his garage and we'd have a beer. And he'd always like, the big thing was like, I might bring over a couple beers for him to try, and he would bring some for me to try. And then he kept on telling me, I mean, I probably went over a few times, and he kept on saying, I have this idea I'm working on. So then eventually he really was, other than crime, he was the only guy that I really knew that was into podcasts as much as I was. And because he had a job that a lot of times he had to work by himself for 8 or 10 hours a day. So he'd pop in podcasts while he was working. And sometimes he'd have to drive long distance. So he was listening to podcasts. Well, I was playing gigs 2 to 3 hours away from my home. So I would listen to podcasts all the time. And so he just said, hey, we should try to do a podcast. And I said, oh, that's awesome. What do you want to do it on? And he's like, true crime. And he had all these things, like he had a saying, like, I want to end every show with be good, be kind, don't litter. I'm like, what does littering have to do with crime? and then he was like, and I want to have a beer. We'll have a different beer every week. And we'll rate the beer. And so he had all this stuff like figured out in his head. And I was like, okay, well, let's try it, because I went to school for audio engineering. So I was like, well, let's just see if we can record and make it interesting. And so I think the first few were just in his garage, and I don't think there's any editing. And I think we had one really crappy mic and one nicer mic. So like the first, I don't know, probably 10 episodes, one of us sounds good, but the other one sounds like crap. And so then we got them, but we got in an argument. So we had like 5 or 6 recorded. We get in this little argument. But my thought was like, oh, well, we recorded that episode, so we know we could do it. We never talked about putting it out to the world. And so his story is different than mine. He says it was a couple days. I think it was a couple weeks that he contacted me and said, hey, man, I'm listening back to our show, and I think it's really good, and I think we should release it. And so I was like, okay, cool. So we figured out how to do that. And I'm coming from the world, because me and Nick were in a band in high school, but he hasn't been in a band in 20 years. And I've been playing in groups since high school and like managing bands and all this stuff. So right when we release it, like the following day, we get like 50 to 100 people go to our website. And I'm like, calling Nick, freaking out. Like, do you know how hard that is? Like, I actually worked for this group one time where my job was just like to go on message boards and basically just like spam people. And the whole thing was like, if I could get 10 people a day to their website,
right.
Like I did my job. And I told him, we had 100 people go to our website. Now, you know this with podcasting. Normally, see, back in the day of podcasting, a little history lesson for newer podcasters. The people that were doing podcasting, you would have to pay for the bandwidth. Well, that bandwidth could be thousands of dollars a month. Well, that changed, and thank God it changed before we started. But our website offered free hosting. So they would host our podcast, but we didn't have any analytics. So we had no clue how many people were listening. And so then one day, like, I don't know, we're probably like, let's say 20 episodes in or so. And so all these feeds are coming from our website. Our website company shut our website down and sent us an email saying, you need to go with one of these podcast hosting sites. They're like $15 a month or something. And they're like, congratulations, you have a successful podcast. Well, we didn't know what that meant. So I upload, I spend all day like transferring the information and getting the podcast feed up and going. But now all of our subscribers are not subscribed anymore. So if that makes any sense, because
Yeah.
a new feed. So I know this because I talked to customer support. So I'm sitting there going, well, they said we made it. They said like we have a successful podcast, but now we lost all of our subscribers. Like this is crap. Like I was like so defeated. Like, this is awful. So I get it switched over, and I think within the first, I don't know, 24 hours, like we had like 7,000 downloads.
Crazy.
I'm like, man, we had 7,000 downloads in a day. And I guarantee you a bunch of our subscribers haven't found us again. And like within the first, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 days, we hit like 100,000 downloads for like all of the episodes combined. And I was just like, that's insane. And so obviously that's like when and it's so good though, because like I said, I can't remember what number episode that was, maybe 20 or so. But the fact that we, that's almost half a year of putting out podcasts, and we had no clue who was listening, who was not listening. And I think that was good for us, because I think by the third or fourth episode, if we would have known 10,000 people were listening to an episode, it would have scared us. And I think it wouldn't have allowed us to be ourselves, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. You would have thought maybe you had to do something else. No, it makes sense.
Yeah. So, and then when you see numbers like that, it was just like, well, now what do we do with it? Now where do we go? So it's, but it's been a blessing and a curse at the same time, because it's a lot of work. And it's not like we have a podcast where we can just hit record and just start talking about whatever we want to. There's a topic every week, and we owe that to the listeners to take every case seriously, and we owe that to the victims. So there's a lot of research and a lot of writing, and the best is when people tell me, oh, must be so great to be the captain, because you just get to show up and you just make stupid, comments when Nick talks. And I'm like, yeah, I have pages upon pages of notes, or some cases it's like I read 2 books in a week. Even in college, I never read 2 books in a week. Yeah. So it's, even though he like directs the show, like I still try to show up and be prepared.
I mean, and you can definitely tell you are. And going back to the internet and the bandwidth and all that, my buddy and I forever ago, long before that, started doing things on the internet, kind of called it internet radio back then. And people would just shit all over us, because you weren't really on the radio. And it's just crazy how those dynamics have changed today when you see the radio declining, obviously, and then podcasting, which is really what it was, is really on the climb.
Well, and what's crazy for me is, 5 years ago when we started, to even say podcast, nobody understood what it was. It was like, yeah, me and Nick, we do a podcast. And most people would be like, what is that? And then you'd start seeing it like in a TV show where somebody would be like, hey, I'm listening to a podcast. And you'd be like, oh, did they just say they're listening to a podcast? Oh my God. Yeah. And also to see the analytics of like, I think when we started, they said like maybe 15 to 20% of people in the world actually knew what a podcast was. And so the listenership of podcasts was so small. Now, look, and I'm a purist, so I'm always going to be sad about this. But what I'm sad about is like all the friends that I met at CrimeCon, they started a show. They grew it from the ground up in their basement or their garage or wherever. And now maybe they're signed to somebody, or they have an agent, or maybe they even sold to a network. And so now they're on a network, but that still was grown organically. And then now you're seeing a lot of celebrities and stuff like that, which is fine. But podcasting used to be really cool because there wasn't a lot of celebrities.
Right.
The majority of the shows I was listening to were self-produced and self-ran. And now it seems like every new show that I hear about it's not somebody that just sat down and put in the work. They have a whole team of people behind them, you know. So, and then it makes me question where it's like these celebrities that are doing it, it's like, well, you have to pay your agent, you have to pay your manager, you have to pay the producer, you have to pay the podcast studio. Like, how are you making any money off this? You know, where people that have grown their show from the ground up have been able to quit their jobs. I mean, Nick doesn't have a job at all. His job is True Crime Garage.
No, I agree. And it used to be like it used to be like really just an independent, an indie kind of theme. And it really has evolved, and where there's money to be made, that, you know, people that have the resources seem to find it for sure. But I think you have a good point, because what makes it work is definitely that you and Nick know each other. That's very evident when you listen to it. There's not any sort of fake engagement or anything at all. And I think it's great, the role that you play, because when I was on the internet with my friend before, I kind of was doing what Nick was doing. I always wanted to, even though we were both well researched, like you said, I always kind of wanted to commentate a little bit. But I think it is important what you do, because it's really hard to do like what a case file does with one person just sitting there dry reading. They can make it work, but I'll be honest, I could never do that, man. So you definitely play your part. I mean, that's 100% sure. What case made you, like, if you said your dad was a detective and all that, would you say there's a case that you remember when you were younger that really got you into true crime? Was it something local or on a national level, or?
Well, just, I mean, first of all, Unsolved Mysteries, it was just like every time it came on, it was so creepy. Like,
oh, I agree. The song and everything.
Yeah, the song, Robert Stack's voice, his cadence. And so that was kind of the start. And then it was also just weird because my father is like so to the books, where you're not supposed to bring home your work and you're not supposed to talk to your family about the cases you're working on. And my dad just didn't. And so I knew more about what other people's parents did at their job than my own father. And I do remember this one case. It was a suicide case, but you have to investigate the suicide. And I just remember my dad coming home like probably once a day, like randomly, stressed out, grabbing something to eat, maybe laying down for a little bit. And then he would leave, and then you'd see him like tomorrow for like 2 seconds. And I just remember watching his beard grow throughout the week because he just wasn't shaving it. And then I remember thinking, because it was actually a friend of mine, his father committed suicide. And I just remember thinking, like, because the whole town was just like sad about it, And I remember like thinking, like, this whole town is sad. We're sad because we knew the guy. But my father has to put all that aside and try to figure out what happened and why. And I just thought, wow, that's intense, like, yeah. I really had a different appreciation for my father after that case. And, but then as you grow up, it's, you have Dateline and things like that. But my mom was obsessed with the O.J. Simpson trial. And I think that really kind of got me into things. And also, like, for whatever reason, like lawyer movies, Lincoln Lawyer, A Few Good Men, A Time to Kill, any movie with a lawyer, Rainmaker, for some reason, I've always been drawn to. So I think that initially, but again, when one of your friends is basically an expert on the subject, we'd have these 4-hour-long conversations about John Wayne Gacy, or I'd hear some coast to coast show and hear something about some serial killer that maybe he didn't know much about, or a crime. And so I'd call him, and next thing you know, it'd be like a 3-4 hour long conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I was out west. So like I mentioned earlier, the Golden State Killer or the East area, all of his previous names.
Yeah,
That's actually a
Ears,
newer one.
yeah.
Yeah. Original Night Stalker. All that stuff was just so fascinating. And I remember just hearing about it and being very intrigued. But the moment where I was hooked is when they pieced them all together with DNA. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness. So you have these two, it's actually ended up being more, right? There was Ransacker and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
you bring these two huge things together and it was the same person. That's like really when I remember there's always the trials from back in the day and all the different stuff. But to me, it was like, holy hell. Then you start getting hooked on the investigative piece of it.
Yeah, I also remember too watching Stephen King's It, and I had some friends over, and we had it on VHS tape, and so we watched it, and I don't know if we got bored of it or maybe we finished it. I'm not really for sure. And then we had another tape that said Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which would have been the first one, and so it's like it pops up and it says like wherever they're at in Texas, and then it says the year, and then before it starts it says based on a true story. And I remember thinking, like, I don't know, halfway through the movie, because it was so intense and probably something I shouldn't have been watching at 10 years old.
Exactly.
But I remember thinking, this is based on a true story. Like, I want to know what this is based off of. And it, it's so loosely based off of people, but it's like, Ed Gein is pretty much the antithesis for Leatherface, but really, other than the fact that he has a mask made out of human skin, there's really no other comparison between the two. But yeah, and then Silence of the Lambs is a big one too.
Oh yeah.
Even though that's not true crime, it's based off of John Douglas's book Mindhunter, and it's really, which a lot of people know this, it's almost an adaptation, because when they couldn't find the Green River Killer, I think it was, I don't know if they reached out to Bundy or if Bundy reached out to them, and Ted Bundy was basically like, I can help you catch this guy. And so they shared case files with Bundy, and Bundy really helped them catch the Green River Killer. And a lot of people have argued that if Ted Bundy didn't get involved, they never would have caught him. And so the premise of Silence of the Lambs is they have this killer named Buffalo Bill, and they're going to use Hannibal Lecter to profile him and figure out how they can capture this guy. And so I think it's funny that there's so many things that are not true, like, these fictional movies that got me into the true crime side.
No, I mean, now that you're bringing that up, I'm start thinking about Halloween and all those things that were probably early stages that did that for myself too.
Yeah, because it's like, that they're based off of something. And yeah, but then what's sad is that the reality is that what they say, the truth is always scarier than fiction. And that's so true. I mean, the amount of stuff that I've read in the last 5 years, I mean, my dreams have become very odd in the last 5 years.
So you talked about earlier how the victims and helping out with that, and you've done a lot, and you could tell in order to do something that you're doing a podcast like that, you have to have a certain level of dedication and passion for what you're doing. And you talked about that earlier. And you're doing it. There's all this technology these days with DNA and everything, but even though social media and then the internet and everything continues to grow, but you're doing it the old fashioned way of word of mouth. You know what I mean? Do you ever have because you've done so many, 500 episodes almost?
Yeah, almost. I think it's 500 next week. So
yeah, it's damn clear. I knew it was damn close to it. Do you ever have any victims' families just reach out to you guys and say, thank you? I mean, because you guys do a hell of a job, and the information in your episodes and everything is just, it's there and it's detailed. Do you guys ever get any kudos for that? Not that you're looking for it, but do you?
I think when we started, we thought, well, we're in Columbus, and this is going out. I mean, that's what's so cool about the internet is you can be doing something in Columbus, and it does not matter. I mean, we have friends of ours that their show has taken off, and they've moved to like bigger cities. And what's funny is, or like they're working on like movies, or they're working on TV shows or whatever, and we keep getting these like weird offers. And Nick's just always been like, well, I wanted to do a podcast, if I wanted to do a documentary, I would have tried to do a documentary, I'm doing what I want to do. But at first it seems like, oh, we're in this garage and we're not connected to anybody. And now it has really changed because some of the biggest cases that we've covered, like the Delphi murders, like we've met all these people, a lot of the victims' family we have met at different conventions, or there's been cases that we covered and then we've become friends. There's a missing person case in Columbus. His name was Joey LaBute, and we become friends with his father, and his father's become a fan of the show. And then on top of that, or like a husband of a murdered victim reaches out and says, hey, I listened to your show, and out of all the people that are covering this and all these people giving their opinions and speculation, you guys didn't do that. You just gave facts. And we really appreciate you getting out to a bigger audience so maybe we can get answers. But then to even go further, we've been contacted by detectives that say, look, we have all this information and the case is going nowhere, but we know you have a large audience. Would you mind covering this case? And so to work with law enforcement, work with people that have investigated a case for 10 years. And then what's nuts is like we did one where the guy was like, we haven't had a lead in, a few years, and the case has basically went cold. We cover the case, and then he's telling us, a couple weeks later, I'm getting all these phone calls. I'm getting all these leads that I never got before. And it's just like, it's surreal. It's like you can't, it's like you're in the movies or something.
Captain, I'm going to guess there's no way you could have predicted that when you first started the journey.
No, and like, there's a case in Ohio. Her name was Barbara Blatnick, and we covered the case. Nick actually does this project called the Project Porch Light, and their whole idea was like, let's get a bunch of creators together, authors, true crime podcasters, private investigators. Let's get this panel together and start taking on cases within Ohio that we can do some good. So what they would do is everybody would bring a case to the table. Nick brings this case, Barbara Blatnick's case. It's not really talked about much. So he starts off by going, hey, I want to work on this case. Well, the panel says, well, we don't know yet. So he says, well, I'm going to cover it on the show. Covers on the show, start getting a bunch of leads, find out that there's some DNA, but because it's such an old case that the police department can't pull the resources. Now imagine this. You have evidence, but it's going to cost you, I can't remember what the cost was, but it was close to like $7,000. And it's just not in your budget to do the testing. So what, after the show and the panel of Project Porchlight going, hey, you guys did a great job covering the show. There's some evidence. They raised the money. They tested it. They were able to match this guy's DNA. They were able to arrest him. He's now in jail, awaiting trial. But they solved it. They solved a murder, I mean, obviously the guy has to go through the trial and everything, but his DNA, like I said, the DNA matched. And I remember telling Nick, so the first case you go out to solve, you solve. That's a pretty good record,
Yeah.
And that's what blows my mind. It's like, but it's tough though too, because it's not something that when I was in third grade that I wanted to be doing 50, 60 hours a week. So, yeah, and even when Nick said, let's do a true crime podcast, my first thought was that's dark and depressing. And I've dealt with, depression and stuff for a long time. And so I have to do a real good job of putting it in its own little compartment. And the days I work on it, I work really hard and to make sure that I don't spend all my time doing it. Or like sometimes because of what we do, I get done and I think, oh, it'd be nice to watch Silence of the Lambs or watch Mindhunter or what's there was a new one, Mare from Easttown that everybody kept on talking about. And I'm like, I don't even know what Mare from Easttown's about other than she's a detective and then she's probably trying to solve a murder. And I know it's a fictitious show, but I need to not watch that because I need to, I'll force myself to watch baseball or whatever so I can have at least a portion of my life that is not focused on murders or disappearance and also too, I know I'm kind of rambling, but once you help somebody, then you feel like you can help everybody.
Yeah.
And then you also feel like that's your like obligation. Like if it could be like midnight and I'm like closing my email just because I noticed it was open or whatever. And I might see something where it's like information about such and such case. And I will have to open it up and look at it because I just feel like maybe somebody will give me information that might solve somebody's case. I mean, because we'll get stuff all the time where then I have to explain to the person, thanks for sharing this with me, but you really need to share this with law enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah. I can definitely see that. And I've heard that from other true crime people. And it's got to be so hard to turn that off. Like you just said, knowing that you can make a difference. It's got to be hard to turn those lights off at night, like you said.
Yeah. And what happens is you end up spending a lot of time. I mean, I've had days where, I started working at 8 and then it's past midnight and I'm on the phone with some private investigator talking about some case that I covered 2 years ago. And maybe by him talking to me, it's just him going over information and him getting a pep talk that he's on the right track or whatever, and so maybe that is doing some good. But there's sometimes where I'm thinking it'd be so much better if I was just, upstairs in my office listening to like an old Beatles record or something, and just like chilling out, because it can become overwhelming.
I imagine that you're talking about how you've been able to help, and that's incredible. But I imagine that just talking to people like that, detectives, investigators, private or not, you have been able to learn so much and grow with what you're doing.
Yeah, I also think and I don't want to like trash the true crime world, but some of these people that are putting out these shows and putting out content, that's what you are. You're a content creator. We're trying to do it in such a way where it's more news-like, where we're not just putting out speculation and things like that. But what you also realize is we're not the ones that had to go to the scene. My father was telling me about this case he covered where a kid went in to rob just a gas station. He didn't need a lot of money, but he needed money for something. I think it was something stupid, like whether he wanted to go out on a date or maybe it was for prom or something. He just didn't have enough money. So he went and he came up with this idea that he was going to rob the local gas station. Well, when he went to rob the local gas station, the lady recognized him because it was his friend's mother.
Mm.
And he ended up then deciding, well, I have to kill her. And he ends up stabbing her like 40 some times. And I just can report about it. I don't have to go into a room and investigate that. I don't have to sit through when they do an autopsy, a lot of times they're bringing these detectives in and explaining to them what they uncovered. And I don't have to do that. I don't think I'm built for that. And that's also a question. If your dad's a mailman, most of the time you're not a mailman. But if you're an NBA basketball star, sometimes the kid becomes a basketball star, or at least follows in his father's footsteps a little bit. And it's weird though, because police and fire, they have a history, and same way with like military. My dad was in the Army, my grandpa was in the Army, so I have to go in the Army. That's just the way some of those work. So I think it was always even a question, even when I was young, are you going to be a policeman like your dad?
Yeah.
And I was just like, no, we're two different dudes, like we're not the same dudes. So I think it's also interesting because I did the show for a long time before I explained to my father what I was doing. And then of course, when I explained it to him, you go podcast. He's like, what the hell is a podcast?
Yeah.
But I remember like showing him how to, look it up on his phone, and now he listens to a bunch of the episodes. And then he's constantly critiquing me, like if I talk trash about the detective, because that's what happens. And he kept on wondering, why is it that every case you're like bashing law enforcement? I'm like, well, the reason why we're talking about a lot of these cases are because they're interesting for some reason. We're not just talking about a case where it's like the husband came home, found his wife cheating, shot her, and then called the cops and turned himself in. And they gathered up the evidence completely correct, got a good confession, made a deal, because the show would be 5 minutes long,
And nobody would listen to it, possibly.
Yeah, it's the cases where, like, Kendrick Johnson, it's a famous case about a boy that, people say he was rolled up in a wrestling mat. That's not what happened, but, was it an accidental death or was it a murder? I don't know. But what you find out through the investigation was there was missteps, too many officers walking through the crime scene, them not collecting certain pieces of evidence. The autopsy goes wrong. Like normally, when you do an autopsy, you keep, all the body parts together. Well, when they went to do a second autopsy and they opened up this kid, all his insides were gone. It was newspapers. And then you find out, you go, that's insane, right? But then you find out that that's common, that sometimes when if the organs become so much of a mess that it's hard to sift through, they'll actually discard the organs and sometimes, put like newspaper or something in its place, just to hold that spot, if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
And so then you go, okay, well, it's not out of realm of a possibility of this happening, but it's already a question of suicide or murder. So it becomes even more of a dicey story,
Yeah. Oh, man. So I just think it's, like I said, I can't tell you how awesome it is what you guys have done. And what I'm trying to do is really highlight the creative aspect of what you've done and what others are doing. So what advice would you give somebody starting out? If they're going to go through their trials and tribulations, they're going to, and I know that your podcast has grown over time. You had a lot of milestones that may have happened fast, but like you mentioned earlier, you were several episodes in. What advice would you give somebody just starting out if they wanted to create a podcast or something like that?
I got a lot of crap to say. Are you ready for this?
That's why I got you, Captain, man.
So I think what got me going initially, like I said, is when Nick said, let's do true crime. Me and Nick were talkers, so we probably could talk about a subject we know nothing about for a good hour. And we get into our own conversation. So it sounds like we're passionate about it. But what I try to tell people is like, because I've had friends that I'm going to start a true crime podcast. I'm like, but are you into true crime? Not really, but I think there's a market there.
Oh boy.
Get into something that you feel like you could talk about forever. And like, even when we started the podcast, I think we were probably like a couple months in, and I went to school. I studied jazz bass and upright bass, and I thought, I could do a podcast about bass playing. And I mean, I probably could, but by the second week that I went to record, I felt like I was running out of conversation. You know what I mean? And so find something that you think you could talk about for a really long time. And how many ideas can you come up with? Start off by writing 10 show ideas. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, if you wanted to have a school about high school experience, you could have one episode on what's the lunchroom like. Number 2, what's it like having lockers? 3, high school schedule. You see what I'm saying? Like, if you can't come up with 10 topics or 10 ideas, or like, even if you want to interview people, well, who do you want to interview? And do you have 5 people off the top of your head that you could email and get an interview from? And so that would be my first thing. Find a topic that you really want to talk about, and then also just record a couple without releasing them. Just see if you can do it. Me and Nick did a thing before we recorded, because you might not want to spend money on the equipment. Well, if you and your buddy are like, hey, we really want to talk about NBA basketball every week. Okay, get on the phone, hit your timer, and see if you can talk for about an hour. And if you can, cool. I think me and Nick's first trial run over the phone, I think we're like 2.5 hours in. And our goal was to record an hour-long show. And we're like, well, I think we have enough here, So, pick a topic that you wanted to talk about often. And then I would say, once you have that, and once you decided that you're going to do it, invest a little bit of money into equipment. Make sure it sounds good, because that's something that you can't change. First impressions are really important. If you go listen to a podcast and the quality is subpar compared to, especially today, like I said, so many celebrities are starting. They have professional engineers. Some of these podcasters, they're going into professional studios. So, of course, there's going to sound a little bit better than yours, but you want to give yourself a fighting chance. And then once you do that, I say pick a time frame, whether it's 3 months, whether it's 6 months, whether it's a year, to see if you get any traction. And what I mean by that is just check in with yourself. Put your nose to the grindstone, do the work, and at 6 months, where are you at? How many listeners do you have? And maybe even create some goals. Like, I have a buddy that started a podcast. He went to CrimeCon with me. He's like, man, I really want to start a podcast. And I told him all these things. And I just said, pick a number. How many listeners do you want to have? Like, if I said to you, you got 500 listeners that listen every week, is that enough? Or is that not enough? And I think his number was like 1,000. If I had 1,000 listeners a week. And now if you look at like analytics, it's almost impossible to get good sponsors with an audience as small as 1,000. And I told him that. I said that's just not enough money to get sponsors. So he does it, puts his nose to the grindstone for, 6 months. Now he's probably at 2,000 listeners per episode. So every time he puts out an episode, it's going to get over 2,000 listens. He has built a small social media following. They're not big enough to get sponsors. He doesn't care. It's not, it didn't because, would he love it to become a big money maker and for him to quit his job and just do podcasting full time? I'm sure he'd love it. But what he decided was he wasn't going to let that be the determining factor. Money is not the factor. Money is not the sole factor of success. So to him now, the way he views it is he has a great job, makes a lot of money at the job, has a great wife, kid, nice house, all that stuff. And then he has this hobby that is really fulfilling. And like I said, 2 years ago, he went to CrimeCon with me. This year, he was invited to it. And he got to sit there and meet people that listen to his show. And you're the same thing that is going to happen to you as your audience grows. Somebody's going to reach out to you one day. I mean, I got one the other week where it was like, I just want to thank you guys for putting on a show. For the last few months, I've been going through chemo. And for whatever reason, I started off my chemo by listening to you guys. And that just became her ritual. She didn't listen to any other podcasts. When it was time for her chemo, she listened to us. And she felt like we're in the room with her. And it's like, how do you even respond to that? Like you're thanking me,
Yeah.
Like thank you for just listening to the show. And also like, because I was such a podcast fan, like when people say, oh, we're best friends, you just don't know we are. I'm like, no, we are best friends. We just haven't met. Because I know what that relationship is, and every person I meet that's like, I listen to your show, I love your show. I'm like, Nick's always like, why do you have to hug everybody? I'm like, because they listen to the show. So don't make it just about that. Make it about putting out something quality. And maybe your show's a funny show. Well, then your job is to make people laugh. Put out a quality show that would make people laugh. And hopefully it gets an audience. Now, on the flip side, you don't need millions of listeners to make a living. Because I'll just share this real quick. There's this theory back in the day when I was playing music. They were talking. The old standard was that you needed about 10,000 fans. Because if you had 10,000 fans and they all bought a record that year for $10, you'd make about $100,000 a year. So $100,000, pretty much any city you live in, not a bad living, right?
Right.
Well, then the concept shifted with, well, what if you had more products? So let's say I'm doing a podcast and I got a t-shirt. That t-shirt's $25. I have, let's say with the True Crime Garage, I have some koozies you can buy. Those are a couple bucks. I also sell some beer glasses. Those are a couple bucks. And oh, by the way, I got a few bonus episodes. Each bonus episode is just $2. But let's say I have 10 of those, right? So now if I have one fan that buys every product that I put out, we'll call that a true fan. And my profit off that individual for the year is $100. Then I only need 1,000 of those. So I need 1,000 true fans to part with $100. And now my income is at 6 figures a year. And any city I can live pretty comfortably and be an artist. And that's initially why I started the Bass Player podcast when the show started, when the True Crime show started, because I thought, hey, well, if True Crime doesn't take off, I think I can get a few thousand bass players, because there was just no bass player podcast. So I thought I could get a couple thousand bass players that would love to have a podcast about playing bass. And maybe they would buy a t-shirt and buy a hat. But even if I don't get 1,000 fans that do that, I just get 500. That's still 50 grand a year. And I come from the land of music. I mean, I was lucky to make, $25,000 a year, So that's kind of a concept that's been going around, 1,000 true fans, and just building from that. So even like my buddy, like I said, he gets about 2,000 listeners per episode. Now, not all those listeners are going to be true fans. They might just be casual fans. But now he's selling some T-shirts, and he's selling some bonus episodes, and he's, selling, a keychain or whatever, just little tiny things. And I think probably if he keeps growing the way he's growing in the next couple of years, maybe it will never be enough for him to, quit his job, but maybe it'll be enough to put his daughter through college. Or maybe it would be enough to pay off his house early. Who knows?
No, those are great. That's great advice. I mean, at the end of the day, though, you still have to have that deep passion with what you're doing as well. And there's definitely, and that has to get you through, especially in the beginning. But like you said earlier about the struggles that could be talking about some of the negative things you do, you still have to have that deep passion in your heart to kind of push through.
Well, and the reason why I tell people to pick a time frame is because it gives you an out. And so I did not do that with my bass player podcast. I basically, the second week I went to record it, I wasn't having any fun. And I was like, I just had this feeling of like, this is not what I want to do. But by having, because one, let's say you take 3 months, so that's roughly about 12 episodes. That's a lot of work. And so if you get to 12 episodes and you go, I'm getting 50 listeners per episode, then I think what you need to examine to yourself is, am I having fun? Yeah, I'm having fun. Then keep doing it, right?
Yeah.
Is it costing you any money? Nah, maybe it costs me $50 a month. Well, $50 a month is a pretty cheap hobby. So continue to do it. Now, some people, they want to do it because they think, oh, it'd be great to have a podcast that blows up. Yeah, that would be great. So try it for 3 months, see if you gain traction. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I've had friends of mine that out of the gate, they're getting a couple thousand downloads per episode. And that's a lot of traction, and you can then take that and grow from it and build an audience and possibly do it full time. But just pick a and then again, another reason why you pick a time frame is like, let's say you did 6 months. So now you're at 25 episodes or so. That's a lot of episodes. And so if you got to that point and just nobody listened, that doesn't mean your podcast was a failure. That just means it just didn't get any traction. It might be very high quality content. You see what I'm saying? But you just didn't find your audience.
Yeah, it just didn't make it out there and in front of people for whatever reason.
Yeah, and so it's like it because I used to be a record producer. I made some great records. Nobody ever heard them. That doesn't mean they weren't great records, or they weren't great songs, or there weren't great musicians on those records. There were great musicians, great songs. Just we couldn't get them. We couldn't get the records in front of enough ears. But every ear that we got it in front of, people were going, "Oh man, that's really good," So even if you get to 6 months in and you're like, don't have any listeners, throw your hands up like you're Rocky Balboa, because you did something that most people never do. And also, like, back to my failure of doing a podcast. Yes, I have a successful podcast, and I have a podcast that failed. Well, it didn't fail because, in the sense of, it wasn't fun. I thought about that podcast. This is no lie. I thought about doing a bass player podcast probably for 5 years. And then, so when we started the True Crime podcast, I'm like, I owe it to myself to do this. I have the equipment now. I'm already doing a podcast once a week. I might as well just put in the extra work. So I did one episode. It wasn't fun. Working on the second episode wasn't fun. And you know what's crazy? In the first week, I almost got 1,000 downloads.
That is crazy.
I was getting traction right away. Like I said, my goal was maybe I could get 3,000 or so bass players to listen. Maybe I make some merchandise, maybe coffee mug, something stupid, and it'll just be fun. And then I'll start calling my bass player friends, and I'll have them on the show. It'll be fun. It wasn't fun to do it by myself. So, but the reason why it's not a failure is I've been doing the true crime show now for almost 6 years. I don't sit around and think about doing the bass player podcast. I sat around for 5 years of my life and thought about doing that. You know how much time that occupied that I could have been thinking about other things? And if I would have just tried it, I would have realized I don't even like it. You know what I mean? So anytime somebody asks me what I do for a living, I mean, now, like 5 years ago, you couldn't say podcast. Nobody knew what the hell you're talking about. Now I say it, they think I'm lying. So I still do audio engineering work, but just because it's a passion of mine, and I feel like if I give it up, that I'll regret it 10 years from now. So I still do some of that work, but that's not my main source of income. The main source of income is podcasting. So now I just say audio engineering because I don't want to get into, or if they go, what's your podcast about? And I go, murder. and then it's like 5 hours later, I'm talking about John Benet Ramsey. And so I try to stay away from that. But it's just so good to, so I meet all these people that go, oh, I've always wanted to do a true crime podcast, or I have this idea for a podcast where I review movies or whatever it is. I just go, do it. Even if you just record it on your phone, do it once or twice, because maybe once or twice is all you're going to need to know that you don't want to really do it. And now you're not thinking, you don't have this idea in the back of your head, oh, one day I'll do this or one day I'll do that.
You can never regret it even if you try it.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like I said, it was just so good. Like I did it and I didn't like it. And I just remember thinking, like, what would have happened if I didn't have the true crime podcast and I would have did this on my own and like bought like equipment, you know, and like did all that stuff and was like, I'm ready for my bass player podcast. You know, like I would have been so depressed. This thing that I've been thinking about, I used to like drive around in my car, like going to gigs, and I'd think about my bass player podcast. And but then I started recording like voice memos to hear like how I sounded.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that's awful because you're like, oh my God, the worst voice ever, you know?
Yeah. Nobody likes their voice normally. Well, there are probably a couple assholes out here that do, but you know.
Well, to me, every time I hear myself, I think I'm dumb. And then I think I'm stoned. And I don't smoke pot, but it sounds like I smoke pot every day. Like when I hear myself back, and then people go, no, you don't sound like you smoke pot. I'm like, I hear it. I sound like a stoner. But no. And so it's like, but it was such like this dream that I had that I think if I didn't do the true crime podcast and I would have just tried the bass player podcast, I would have been so depressed. Like, oh man.
Why didn't I try it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, but then, like I said, once you try it, it's like, then I just went, well, man, I'm so glad I did try that because I don't think about it anymore. And actually there has been bass player podcasts that have come around and I listen to them and I'm fans of theirs. And I know they don't have a big following because it's a smaller subject, you know? And I would also suggest that to people that want to do something, pick a small subject. Like crime, there's tons of stuff to talk about, but it's a small subject. I have friends of mine that are like, I'm going to do a sports show. You know how many sports are out there? Like maybe just pick a niche, you know?
Yeah, it's a wide, yeah.
Soccer, you know, whatever it is.
And that's amazing advice. I could talk to you all day, but I have to eventually let you get back to your evening. You've been powering through these interviews all day. I can't
Well, you
thank
can
you
see,
enough.
you can see, I just run my mouth. It's just blah, 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 blah.
Professional talker.
Hey, but the nice thing, my father used to tell me, which this is hilarious. My father used to say to me when I talked to him on the phone, he'd say, if you could just find somebody to pay you to talk. And it was funny because he was telling me that, and I knew, like, I mean, we're probably like 30 episodes in already. And like we had a sponsor here and there, and we had people donating money to the beer fund, and just a lot of listener support, because here you can find us on, Sirius XM and Apple Podcast and all that stuff. We're still independent. I mean, we have a ad agent that we work with, but we're not owned by a company. It's still just me and Nick in a garage. We don't have assistants. I still fold t-shirts every week and ship them out. But it's our full-time gig, and we're paid well, which is nice, but that's just what we want to do. We don't want to hire a producer. We don't want somebody else editing the show for us. Sometimes people go to our website and they go, your website looks a little generic. I'm like, well, that's the best I can build, because I don't want to pay for somebody else to do it, because that was not the idea from the beginning. And we just thought, like, if it hinders the growth of the show, who cares? Because at least it'll be authentic, and we'll be our true authentic selves. And we won't have some producer telling us, to make some yuck joke, or do this, or pretend to hate each other, or pretend to, whatever. So to keep it authentic. And I was going somewhere with this. Oh, but so then eventually I got to tell my father, hey, yeah, Dad, people are paying me to talk. And that's when I had to tell him about the podcast.
Sure, that was a cool feeling. No, and I think the theme that you guys have and that whole independent thing it makes it very personable, and that's what makes it work. Like I said, man, I love the podcast. I have since I come across it. I've listened to it every week since, and I really do appreciate you doing this interview with me today.
I appreciate it, and it'd be interesting to, if you ever need somebody to interview you, maybe like after 6 months of putting out the podcast, I'll come back on and I could ask you how's it going, and what are you trying, and what do you find working for your podcast and what's not working, and maybe and again, don't ever hesitate if you have a question about anything. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I'll let you know as much as I can.
And I appreciate that. I really do. Everybody listening, if you haven't heard these guys before, you have to check them out. True Crime Garage, truecrimegarage.com. Hell, you can find the podcast anywhere. I think that's safe to say, right, Captain? I mean, it's
on
everywhere.
All the platforms. Yeah.
Most people listening to this probably are familiar with platforms and all that. So
yeah,
maybe we'll have some baby boomers on here, Captain. Hell, I don't know, man. But hey, thanks again. I do appreciate it, man.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks for listening, and thanks for telling a friend. But more importantly, thank you for supporting independent content creators. I hope you enjoyed this episode and continue to listen to the upcoming ones. I'm really trying to do something special here by highlighting all the amazing things all these amazing content creators are doing. I hope you continue to join me on my journey. I'm Jeff, aka Podcast Father, the Indie Podcaster. Keep being you, keep being great.
Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com. See you next time.